Yes, good evening everyone. Very warm welcome. Welcome in the Balie. Welcome to NATO Night, the 2022 edition after 2 years of COVID where it was all digital. It's really good to see everyone also physically again in a hall. My name is Tim Wagemakers. I'm a journalist and your moderator for tonight. And I'm also speaking directly towards the camera because there are also millions of viewers watching this right now from home. So also a warm welcome to you all. Well, this year marks the 73rd anniversary of NATO, and I think we could say that this event couldn't be more timely than this year with the war in Ukraine going on right now. Tonight we'll have two panels that in the midst of current developments tries to paint a bit of a broader picture. In our first panel we're going to discuss what are our geopolitical challenges for NATO in this changing world, and also how do short-term decisions right now shape the future of it in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And in our second panel we will dig a bit deeper into how power shifts might result in new ways of war, such as hybrid wars. The evening is organized by the Netherlands Atlantic Youth, as I think many of you are well aware, and that aims to involve more young people into the dialogue about NATO. Between the two panels there will be a short break where you can also get a beer and a drink. I see some people are starting to get more attention when I say that. Yes, there's also a short break. And I suggest we just get started without further ado. So to kick this all off, I'd like to give the floor to the chair of the Netherlands Atlantic Youth. Give him a warm welcome. Koen Meijer.
Thank you, Tim. Tonight we're celebrating the 73rd birthday of NATO, right? And as Tim already said, it's an alliance probably more important than ever before. I would like to welcome you all here. It's great to see you. The past two editions, we only had a public that was joining us online, and it's great to have you here live again. Special thanks to our digital attendees as well, and of course a special thank to our speakers and the team that helped organize NATO Night tonight. And tonight I would like to talk to you about the preparations we did for NATO Night, because we started preparing for NATO Night as we always do. So we started thinking about a best way to celebrate 77 years of freedom in the Netherlands and how to celebrate it, and the challenges ahead for NATO. We started thinking about discussing climate change, migration, hybrid warfare, all those kind of topics. And while doing so, well, as you all may know, the situation in Europe changed drastically. And so we have a very different NATO night for you tonight than we initially thought of. And perhaps these preparations are exemplary for our generation. Most of us have been preoccupied with widening the concept of security, war, and strategy. We've shifted our views to other topics that ask for our attention. And while doing so, we might have actually missed the very harsh reality we live in. Well, it's clear that with the invasion of Russia into the Ukraine, that situation is on again. And the very precondition to our way of living, our security, is at risk again. So tonight we're not only celebrating, we're also discussing the ways ahead and how do these situations affect us. In the first instance, the Dutch ambassador to NATO will share her insights with us. Tonight, the foreign ministers of NATO, they came together and discussed the situation in Ukraine. And perhaps she has some very insightful things for us. So I'm looking forward to that discussion. And then, as Tim already said, we have two panels. So the first one will look into the geopolitics of the world. What consequences has the war in the Ukraine? And is NATO prepared to deal with that threat? This summer, NATO will come up with a new strategic compass. So it will redefine its purpose. And what will that purpose be? Will it be only focused on Russia, or will there be other things as well? In the second panel, we'll focus on the ways of war. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, many thought the nature of war has changed. Well, you know, it might actually, like the current situation, might actually be the main example that the wars have not changed, right? This is something that they always say the generals prepare for the previous war. Well, perhaps this is similar like the previous war. And NATO is not brain dead or obsolete anymore. So besides the pessimistic picture I just painted, I think there is also a reason for hope. We see serious attention for our security again, also amongst our generation, which I think is very good. And throughout the alliance, all over NATO, people come together and stand up against Russian aggression and are willing to defend our values. I think it's up to our generation to build bridges again and to stand stronger together. And I'd say, as tonight is called Challenge Accepted, I think we have to accept that challenge. Thank you. And then it's my honor to announce our Dutch ambassador to NATO. She just came here from Brussels, and we're very much looking forward to your insights, Marissa. Welcome.
Yes, thank you, Koen, and thank you, Tim. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you very much for organizing this NATO Night again. Last time I was here was 2 years ago, before COVID, and I think it was in Tivoli in Utrecht, where we had a whole theater full of young people who were sharing their questions, but also their insight with us. I remember that we had about 50 Ukrainian students there that night, and that we had a very thorough discussion on the open door policy, and that seems a short time ago, but also a long time ago. Thank you also very much for keeping up the good tradition, and even in COVID time you kept on organizing these virtual events, and I think I even participated in one. And I think the last time I discussed with the Atlantic Council, but maybe it was your older brother, I'm not sure, in Newsport, and I think the title was, "Is NATO brain dead or alive and kicking?" And that also seems a long time ago when we were actually asking that question, because I think nowadays nobody would actually ask that question anymore. As you said, I came straight from the the Ministers of Foreign Affairs, they met. So I don't really have a speech for you, but I can share a few of the insights. I wrote a few down on the way to Amsterdam. And it was a ministerial one in a row of many, because since the invasion we had 2 summits already, one virtual and one really in person, also President Biden traveling to Brussels to meet his colleagues and to actually steer the alliance. But we had also an extra ministerial for foreign affairs, for defense, and now we had our regular one. So we have ministers almost visiting every week. And I think that proves the point that NATO is actually alive and kicking. And it better be alive and kicking, because the security environment, it deteriorated severely. And I mean, since the invasion, we are really in a different situation. I mean, we had a pre-warning already in 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea, and maybe even in 2008 when he was playing the same trick in Georgia. But I think now, I mean, things really, really do look different. And so we do talk about unprecedented times. I mean, this is a P5 member, a nuclear-capable country, violating the sovereignty of its neighbor and actually targeting its civilians as well, as we saw this weekend with the atrocities that were all over the news. And that is indeed unprecedented. And it's also, we think, extremely dangerous. And so NATO had to step up to the plate, and NATO did step up to the plate. But also, and you all know and are aware of it, we are very concerned and very careful, because we think we have to do our utmost not to escalate it into a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. We think that is very important. And within those political parameters, we are doing whatever we can. And let me give you the 3 different pillars of what NATO is actually doing at this moment in time. First of all, strengthen and support Ukraine where we can. And these are the allies and partners who are actually are providing this support. And this was discussed today at NATO when the Ministers of Foreign Affairs convened. The Minister of Ukraine was there as well, Minister Kuleba. He traveled from Ukraine through Poland, I think, to be with his colleagues. He was not the only partner who was in this session. We had 9 different partners of NATO taking part in that session. So we had Ukraine, we had Georgia, we had Sweden, Finland, we had the EU with the High Commissioner Borrell, and we had the partners from the Asia Pacific, so that's Korea and Japan, Australia and New Zealand. And to be together with these 39 countries, I think was absolutely unprecedented as well. Being there together, exchanging views, and absolutely promising that they will continue and step up the financial support, the military support, and the humanitarian support to the Ukraine. Because we do think that it is the sovereign right of Ukraine to defend itself, and we can only admire the courage of its population. And I think all the ministers around the table have expressed that admiration. All allies and partners pledged to do more, and we also think this is important to actually strengthen the hand of Ukraine at the negotiation table whenever the time is actually there to truly and honestly negotiate. Because although there are some talks taking place at this moment in time, it doesn't look like a very serious negotiation. And we do think that they need a very strong hand by the time that they will meet Russia at this negotiation table. Then the second pillar of what NATO is doing, and that is, well, what NATO and allies together with EU and partners, let me broaden the group a little bit, is impose severe costs on Russia in different ways. Because we do think it should be absolutely clear to Putin that he is isolated, that it will actually hurt, that through the sanctions that we have negotiated both in the EU together with the non-EU allies within NATO, we think that these costs are going to be severe. Sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. But we also think that that we also need very active diplomacy, because what we do see at this moment in time that Russia and Putin is also using these severe sanctions to actually play the card of the victim, and we saw the voting patterns in the General Assembly in the UN, where 141 countries actually condemned Russia, which was a good number, but still there are quite some countries who didn't take a stance or who were washing their hands during the voting, and we still think that's a considerable group, and that we do actually have to influence that narrative, and that we do actually have to debunk all the disinformation that we see coming from Russia and that's being amplified by different countries, and actually being accepted by quite some different countries and their populations. So we do need active diplomacy, and that was something else that was discussed today at the ministerial. And then the third point is that we have to strengthen our posture at the east flank, that we have to make sure that our deterrence and defense is actually strengthened. And we started that already in 2014 after the illegal annexation of the Crimea. I'm sure that you're all aware of the 4 battle groups that were installed in the countries that were bordering Russia. And the air policing that's taking place at this moment in time as well. But we're stepping up, and we're stepping up. For the first time in the history of NATO, our response plans are being activated. We have 40,000 troops that are under the direct command of SACEUR, under the direct command of NATO, let me put it that way. And we have 100,000 American troops on our continent at this moment in time. And that is, as well, I think, unprecedented. And I think we reacted swiftly, decisively, and we passed that test. And I think rightly so. because a lot is at stake. And if we zoom out a little bit of what's happening actually in the Ukraine, we see that Russia is actually playing a spoiler role in more theaters. If you look at what's happening in Syria, if you look what's happening in the Sahel, you all have heard of the Wagner Group. So we have to make sure that we're not totally obsessed by only this one theater where this terrible invasion is taking place at this moment in time. But we also have to keep an eye on what China is doing, because we're all aware that also China is unwilling to condemn Russia's aggression. And we could see in the statement that was issued by Xi and Putin together that actually China is joining Moscow in questioning the right of nations to choose their own path. And we think that's serious, and we think that's of grave concern. So those are issues that were discussed today by the ministers. And for me and for all around the table, it was important again to really witness that unity around the table of democracies actually coming together and pushing back, because we're all aware that this is a serious moment. And also, I think what we saw is that NATO is passing the test of actually creating this indispensable forum for consultation and coordination. I mean, I think you all remember, and that was the title of that one discussion that I was invited for, Brain Dead or Alive and Kicking. That was President Macron, who gave an interview to The Economist and complained about a brain dead NATO because there were some quarrels among allies in the northern part of Syria. There was some misunderstandings and confusion, and in the Eastern Med, and let me not go into all the details. And then the whole process of NATO 2030 was started, and the reflection process. And one of the points that was very important at that moment in time was to have a stronger political NATO. It's a political military organization, and that was one of the outcomes. But for me, it's very important that we've never been tested to this extent, I think, before as NATO. I mean, we've been through a lot as an organization, but to be tested as we are tested today, it's very important, I think, that we passed that test, and that we actually see and hear around the table that it's the Washington Treaty, an ironclad commitment to Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. That NATO is a defensive alliance. I say it again, I think it's very important to keep on reiterating that we are a defensive alliance and that we're no threat to another country. Let's also not forget that NATO actually tried to build that partnership with Russia. We can still read about it in the strategic concept of 2010, how we were dreaming of that partnership, that we actually reached out time and again to meet, to discuss. There was even one more NATO-Russia council with two vice ministers. I think it was in January, so it was not so long before the invasion actually took place. It was a long discussion. It took like 4 or 5 hours, and we invited them again to join us for 3 other of these councils to discuss everything, also their concerns, and they didn't accept that invitation. So although we think that a constructive dialogue is not very likely at this moment in time, we still think that we will always keep on needing engagement, because what you want to absolutely avoid is miscalculations. So we will always try to engage and make sure that we reduce the risks, because that's most important of all at this moment in time. Now, I just mentioned the strategic concept of 2010. Maybe just to give you a few pointers, and then let's see what kind of questions there are. The reflection process, I mentioned it already, NATO 2030, military, a strong alliance, let's keep it that way. That was the point made. Politically, we should make sure that it's more of a forum for consultations. Also, if allies don't agree, let's meet and discuss. I think we're doing really well, and we proved it again today and yesterday. And the third point was the global approach. because I'm sure that you're aware that cyber and space are now two operational domains of NATO. So next to land, sea, and air, cyber and hybrids. And it will be discussed at the panel table, so let me not go into details, but cyber and space doesn't have any boundaries. So in essence, it is a global issue. And because of that, we could see that cyberspace, but also the supply lines. I think COVID actually revealed how dependent we are of other places in the world, investment patterns, the whole 5G discussion, but also the fact of Chinese investing in our ports. That has also a security impact for us. Coercive policies, disinformation, these are all issues that can come from the other part of the world and that can actually influence us. So this global approach will be very important in the new strategic concept that we're going, I think we will start actually discussing it next week. It was discussed by the ministers, but the first draft will be on our table to negotiate on next week, because we would like to conclude it, or it will be concluded, we don't only like it, but we have to conclude it, for the leaders to actually decide upon at the summit in Madrid. And we will see that, unfortunately, the dream of building a partnership with Russia is a bit far off at this moment in time. We will include also China, not necessarily as an adversary, but as a systemic rival. And we have to be aware of some of their policies that are actually, that can pose actually sometimes a threat as well. But we will always look at China also as a competitor and as a partner for certain issues. Issues like hybrid, terrorism, resilience, disinformation, climate change. I know that you are all probably very interested in climate change and what NATO will do about it. Innovation is very important. The accelerator that's going to be launched, where young startups will be supported by NATO, and an innovation fund will be established. In order to keep that technological edge, we will invest far more into partnerships. And let me just also, as a kind of a pointer, not only mention the AP4, Asian Pacific, 4 countries, but also the European Union, very important. And I just mention it just to see where the questions are, because otherwise I talk for too long. So let me just finish. I mean, young people were included in the whole reflection process. I think I met Koen, or did I meet both of you when we discussed with the Prime Minister? I think you met Koen. I met Koen there, yeah. And I met you as well, yeah. I remember, I recognized a few faces, because the Prime Minister was also very interested to hear your opinions. And I was really impressed, because you prepared it really well. You all had like clear recommendations for the leaders of what you thought was important. And I remember that as a very important meeting. And so again, I'm here tonight also to hear what your concerns are, what your ideas are or recommendations. And let me see. I got it here. I have my pen. I'm going to write it down. I'm going to bring it with me to Brussels. So let me stop here and see what kind of questions or what kind of insights or comments or what you would like to share with me.
Thank you so much, Marisa Gerard. Thank you also for so eloquently already putting forward the agenda of the 2 panels we're having, so that's really nice. Are there any questions? Because then we have Niels, who's coming towards you with the microphone, which is necessary for the people at home to also hear it. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, because I'm sure you want to take, advantage of this situation. I saw someone very hesitantly raising their hand in the back. Was that true, or were you pointing to someone? Yes, there's someone in the back. Maybe while he walks there, I have one question to you. You said systemic rival. What is a systemic rival? What does that mean? I was just wondering, because
a systemic rival is a country who has a thoroughly different view of of international relations. And what you see at this moment in time is how authoritarian regimes actually team up to undermine the international rules-based order. And that is of grave concern. If you see that a country is just violating the sovereignty of its neighbor, these are elements of our rules-based order that we all agreed upon. I mean, it's in our UN Charter, it's in different documents that were, signed by all these countries. And now that you see that these kind of authoritarian regimes actually team up to undermine that international order, that is what we call a systemic rival, because it's more and more, and I mean, I'm quoting Biden now, I think, who puts it all in a kind of a frame of democracies actually discussing with autocracies on how we would like to organize that international order. And that is, I think, the discussion that is taking place at this moment in time. Also within the UN, you can see how that discussion is taking place.
Okay, there was a question there. Yeah, hello.
So you already mentioned it briefly, talking about countries which didn't condemn the attack or aggression on Ukraine. I was wondering what your opinions were on how we should coerce or at least try and influence these countries like India, China, or Iran, or maybe some non-aligned countries. How should we influence them? Should we only use positive means? Should we actually try and coerce them? Try and really make them switch sides. What are your insights on that?
Yeah,
maybe a little bit of everything. I think it also depends what country you're talking about, and you have open and silent diplomacy, and you can see also the way the UK or the US is dealing with China. Actually really talking to China and saying, you are a very important partner in the international order as we know it, and we want you and we expect you to behave responsibly. And if you will not act and behave responsibly, I think there is this kind of an in between the lines kind of threat that they will be hit by sanctions as well. The question is that the best strategy for all countries that are on the fence or not? I think it depends. I think you need different kind of discussions. I mean, I used to be the ambassador in South Africa, and still 5,000 of my followers on Twitter are from South Africa. And it's kind of interesting to see how #StandWithPutin is trending. And I have quite some people who actually discuss with me, and also with my husband Peter. They sent us fact sheets and saying, well, these are the facts. And actually, these are narratives that are from A to Z are the Russian narrative. And I can see that on a one-on-one basis, it's already rather easy to convince them. So I think coercing is not always the best way to deal with all countries, because that's also a little bit, I think, the trauma that some of these countries have with the West, that the West used to coerce them in history. And then sometimes it's better to meet them with an open hand and have a thorough and honest discussion. So I would say let's make it tailor-made, but let's look for a strategy. I think that's important.
Any other questions, comments? Yes, there's one a few rows before you.
So the word sanctions was already mentioned. So I was wondering, we are right now raising the costs for the Russian Federation in a lot of ways through our sanctions, but it's also a limited means. At some point we have sanctioned everything. They're out of SWIFT, they're not allowed to trade with us anymore, they can't fly over Western airspaces anymore. But they don't really seem to deter or change the strategic thinking in the Kremlin. So what's the exit scenario with regards to sanctions?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's always the setback of sanctions, that when are you going to end them? When are you going to enter into a new phase? What we do hope is that these sanctions will actually force Russia to the negotiation table and will strengthen also the hand for the Ukraine. Because although they don't seem to work maybe now, it always takes a bit longer to actually work for sanctions. And if I see that the economy of Russia is contracting with 10 to 15% now, that's quite considerable. considerable, I think. So I think you need a little bit more time to see actually if it will work or not. And so we are in this for the long haul. I think all of us, we realize this is not something that's going to be finished in a very short period of time. But to actually really send that signal that if you behave like this, you are not part of the international order as we think is a respectable international order. And maybe to go back to South Africa that I know so well, maybe what even worked better in the case of South Africa is actually blocking them for participating in international sport events or cultural events. I think that can sometimes even hurt a country more than just financial sanctions. So if we don't want to enter into a direct confrontation with Russia, and I think that would be very, very unwise because of the fact that it's a nuclear-capable adversary that we're talking about, then I think this is one of the instruments that we actually have if we don't just want to accept what's happening at this moment in time. Yeah. So it's the best we have, I think.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Are there? Yes, there's one, 2 rows in front of you. Yeah.
You mentioned Macron and the statement he made about NATO being brain dead. I think, if I remember correctly, that was also in the end of the Trump era.
Sorry,
the end of the Trump era. I remember that Macron made a statement in relation to that era in time. Are you somehow, in your job in Brussels, also preparing for another change of presidency in that sense, since the USA is the biggest partner in NATO?
Yeah.
And now it seems we're not brain dead anymore, but what if in 2 years of time things swift change around again?
Yes, it's a very good question. I've been ambassador also in those years, and let me give you a very general answer, because I mean that's, I think, the consequence of having an alliance of democracies, that you never know who will win the next elections, and as long as democracies still function, there's always another chance. And I think in the meantime what we need are very strong institutions, and make sure that these institutions can take whatever outcome of elections that are taking place in the different countries in the alliance, and I think we will be fine. And so in that sense, for me, it's very important to see that in the 4 years, almost 4 years that I've been ambassador at NATO, I could see that NATO actually really grew and really is a much stronger organization now than it was 4 years ago. So that gives me some peace of mind for whatever elections in whatever country.
Last question. Is there someone? Yes, there is a question on the left. There was also someone else, so there's a bit of pressure on that it's a really good question. But
well, the sanctions to Russia have already been mentioned, but
sorry, can you start again?
The financial sanctions to Russia have already been mentioned, but at present we still exclude the oil and gas trade we have with Russia. At present we are still financing thus the military war in Ukraine that Russia is waging. So would it not really give force to the sanctions if we would also take actions there, but at what price to us?
Yeah.
Yes, it would. True, and it's being discussed, it's being prepared as well. The discussion, by the way, takes place within the European Union in relation and discussing also with other partners like UK, US and others, because you're absolutely right. And the fact that we're so dependent still on oil and gas from Russia is really a vulnerability. And I think that wake-up call came now. I think it's already very important that Nord Stream 2 is actually off the agenda. And I mean, I do hope that this will also help us with the whole energy transition, and that we absolutely understand that we need that transition not only to actually tackle this crisis, but also to tackle the even more impactful crisis, the climate crisis that we're in. So, can only agree with you.
I'd like to thank you so much for your great start to our NATO Night, and also keep up the good work and give her one more time a warm hand. Marisa Gerards. And after this introduction, we'll dive right into our first panel, but not before we look at a short video that will introduce the topic of that panel.
I worry about the future security landscape of the Netherlands because it's such a small country, and I believe that we cannot safeguard our country by ourselves, or safeguard Europe for that matter. That's why I believe in the importance of the relationship with our NATO allies.
Our generation's voice is very important to listen to because we are the future and we will be the generation that will counter these threats in the years to come.
The thing I fear the most is that it will accidentally spill over to a conflict with NATO, so an accidental rocket or something like that. That will be my biggest fear.
Two reasons. So the first is to act as a deterrence, for example, to make enemies or potential threats aware that we are not to be messed with. Other reason is capabilities. Capability to counter a threat when it's actually rising.
I think this situation in the East shows that we should all see if we can get to the 2% norm at the minimum.
I think the main challenge for NATO is maintaining unity. We of course have the physical threats. We see what happens if you are not in NATO, what can happen and how that can affect the security of common people like you and me.
Well, over the years we have seen that we have grown accustomed to this rule-based liberal world order. And I think that the Ukrainian conflict shows that states will go against these core norms of state sovereignty and territorial integrity. So in that sense, I think we see that they're undermining the liberal order that we know today.
I do worry about the security landscape. Something I fear, or one of the things I fear the most, is the short-term memory most people have. And I hope that people think or that they won't forget about the crisis in the next 5 or 10 years, because then we're back to...
I think our generation has kind of taken peacetime for granted. If I speak for myself, we've never seen a war in Europe before. So I think we've taken peace for granted and the role that NATO plays in the defense of the continent as well.
Yes, so in this panel we will tackle geopolitical challenges in a changing world. I think we've already had quite a concise introduction to what that's all about. And we have an esteemed panel to do that with. We have Bob Dane, Kimberly Kruijver, Christophe Cornu, who is with us through Zoom, and Michel Kerres. So give them a warm welcome also. Let's start with Bob Dane. I mean, I was preparing for this panel and I was thinking geopolitical challenges in a changing world. We have 35 minutes. That's big. But at the same time, I was thinking you have been informing Dutch audience so much in the last months. I think I've seen you almost every day. It's a bit less now on the NOS or on other fora. You are Senior Research Fellow and Team Leader on Security and Defense, Coordinator of the Russia and Eastern Europe Center at Klingendahl. In all those media outlets that you've been, always trying to analyze what has been going on, do you have time, or have you found time to step back and reflect a bit on the turning point we are in right now? Because if we look at what's going on, the role of NATO therein, also the way Marisa described it, we are really seeing fundamental changes happening.
No, absolutely. And I mean, Europe changed, and I would even argue the world changed after the invasion. But my life also changed quite a bit. And you mentioned the media appearances and the difficulty of stepping back. I mean, we're with a young audience here, and I'm sorry I'm half with my back turned to you. I've been speaking to people through cameras for 2 years. I was very much looking forward to speaking to live people. But I'll do it like this, if you don't mind.
And we have drinks afterwards.
And that's a good thing. Yeah. That's something to look forward to. Yeah. You know, there's an even younger audience I had to address, which was probably the hardest, which is the Jeugdjournaal, the kids' news in the Netherlands. And the fact that, and I came home one evening after having to explain to children what is the nuclear weapons in the 21st century. What is war? Why is war back in Europe? And they asked very good questions, like why don't we just put Putin in jail? And I had to explain also to them what is NATO and what is an alliance. And then sometimes when you're at home at night and you're reflecting on these things, it's quite difficult. And I asked my own kids, what did you think of it? And my son said, actually, I don't worry so much anymore, because now I know we're safe, because our army is stronger than that of Russia. And we are many countries. And the fact that children get really to the heart of things with these questions, because that is, of course, what an alliance is for. And last week I was in Vilnius, and I had the pleasure of seeing the anniversary, the 18th anniversary of Lithuania joining NATO. And there were children on that square. And the way NATO is alive in the Baltic states. I mean, I'm glad we're here for NATO Night. You should see it in Lithuania, where this is for people of existential value that they're part of this alliance. I think that's what we've seen.
Yeah.
We're back in an era that we would much rather have forgotten. And now we have to realize that the old tools that we designed in the 1940s, the 1950s, and afterwards, that we still need them. And they might be more relevant, as the ambassador said, and as Koen said, now than ever. But I am still very sad I had to explain that to children, I have to admit.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Michel Keres, diplomatic editor for NRC Handelsblad. I mean, you've been writing extensively for the past decades about international politics, also NATO. Is this also, for you, if you hear Bob talk also, I mean, I can imagine that feeling the concept of security is something, it's not only theoretical, but for many years it has been a sort of theoretical conversation for you to explain to people. Is it also for you in your work a turning point in the way you look at NATO, or the way you sort of describe it to people, or the attention you get with it?
Well, of course, the attention was not a problem. That used to be the problem long before, that you would write about NATO and strategic compass and strategic ideas, and people say, well, yes, okay, well, we'll see about that, and you get a small corner in the paper. Ever since, I think it started in November, December, then when things started to heat up, the situation that people would start paying attention. And then, of course, you realize that you're witnessing something and trying to explain something that you're really entering a new world. Because I think the saddest thing is that we have lost Russia to some degree as a partner that you can talk to as long as Putin is in power. Yeah. And that's something that just gradually people are realizing that it's not just the war Russia against Ukraine, but that the whole system that has been built since '45 is put up for discussion. And then we will come out of this with a different world somehow. Yeah. And I think to realize that and try to explain that and bring that across was, I think, the main task I gave myself the past few weeks.
But I think then also, if this panel is called Geopolitical Challenges in a Changing World, then at the same time you wish you were able to get that across a few years ago, maybe already, right?
Yeah, so that's the one big discussion we have. Shouldn't we have paid more attention? In 2008, I remember what happened in Georgia. I was on vacation in Switzerland, and I was buying a Kuckucksclock in a small Swiss village. And there was a guy with an old transistor radio, something that is gone now. And there was something on the news like the Russians are entering a different country. It was like, what is this? And then the shock was there, and it passed within the summer. And I think in 2014 it came very close, especially to the Netherlands, but we didn't really think it through. We kept on hoping that with what we now call appeasement again, but what we then thought was diplomacy and reach out and having contacts with Russia would get us along. And we're at the point that we have to think, did we make a huge mistake?
Yeah. Kimberly Kruijver, you are a researcher, strategic security affairs at TNO. If you listen to all this, then there's also the added dimension of the past 10 years of these hybrid threats, of the new reality we live in that's not just confined to land, but also to the sort of infinite digital world. For you, is this also a turning point in the way we look at hybrid threats? What's going on these past few months?
Yes, well, I think there's a difference between so the expert community, right, who have been researching hybrid threats for quite some time. In fact, I think, what was it, about 3 years ago, we already wrote an article at the Klingendahl Institute claiming that the strategic concept of NATO should start an update, right, and also incorporate hybrid threats, including cyber, disinformation, also everything that Marisa just mentioned in its document. And I think right now that's actually happening, and I think that indeed the war in Ukraine is giving more emphasis to that, also to the general public, so to say. Yes, I see more attention is given to that in the wider media landscape. But what I really hope is that the strategic concept will not only emphasize the importance of these threats, but will also provide some sort of guideline as to how to actually tackle them, right? And also with whom.
Yeah, and maybe if Bob goes to his children again tonight and he tries to explain these hybrid threats, then what is the thing concisely that we really should be dealing with? How would you explain that?
Well, I think, especially if you're going to talk to your children about it.
Should be asleep by the time I get back.
Oh, that's a good addition to that, yeah.
Yeah, so if we're talking about the younger generation, and I think I can count myself with that as well, we grew up in a digital world, right? So we're using social media a lot. And then the easiest way to explain the importance of hybrid threats for these people at home is the disinformation part. So if you're using social media and you see certain messages, always be sure what is the source of the message that you're seeing, right? And what are the interests of the specific actor that posted that specific message on social media? I think that's quite an easy lesson that we can just bring home and teach Bob's children.
And I should also teach my children to change your passwords very often and not use your private email account for work-related issues, which I think is important, but also digital literacy and media literacy is essential.
You never know who's watching, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Let me introduce our last guest to the panel, who is with us through Zoom, Christophe Cornu, Officer NATO Affairs and Security Policy in the Political Affairs and Security Policy Division. Great to have you here. Thanks so much for being with us. Mr. Cornu, if you listen to what we've been discussing so far, has your work also changed in the past few weeks in the way that Marissa described, that we're at a turning point in the way we look at NATO, maybe also again since the past decades? Is it also a turning point for you in your work?
Thank you, and very pleased to be with you tonight from Brussels. And thank you for inviting me to this very, very dynamic and stimulating discussion. Yes, from the HQ in NATO point of view, of course, this invasion by Russia of Ukraine was a very, very deep shock, of course. And for us, it was the sort of concrete challenge for being reactive, as all allies were expecting we were to be. SecGen, all the NATO tools were sort of used in a crisis mode, including on the other side of the Atlantic. A lot of the capitals made very quick and prompt reactions. The US were able to send thousands of troops across the Atlantic to reinforce allies. European countries as well, sending a lot of equipment to Baltic states and also to Ukraine in a different manner. So the NATO ambassadors were met very, very frequently, very quickly. The military committee worked very well. All the NATO bodies were really reactive. And of course, it was not planned as such, but the NATO tools and the capitals were very reactive.
Yeah. And if we talk about this strategic concept, the notion has been mentioned a few times. Can you explain to us how important that is for the functioning of NATO in the coming 10, 20 years? Because we talk about strategic concept 2030, so that's already in 8 years, but it's going to shape the future of how we look at NATO and its mandate also maybe. So can you help us in trying to, what is this going to change if we do it correctly? Because we're right now talking about it, negotiating still. What's the weight of it?
Well, the main challenge for this key document for the coming decade will be to find the right balance between the current crisis we are still dealing with and the need to keep a sort of long-term, medium-term, and long-term approach to a potential of a crisis. And the current core tasks of the Lisbon strategic concept, combining collective security, cooperative security, and crisis management, might be adjusted in the light of course, what we are currently dealing with, but also what we had to address in the coming in the last 2 or 3 years. So the negotiations will start shortly. We have 3 months to negotiate and to find a consensus for the end of June Madrid summit. There is already papers on the table, already discussed by the 30 ambassadors, but things now will speed up, and we should have a sort of first draft just after Easter for 2 or 3 months of negotiation. I think you will be, of course, keep posted about the progress. Yeah. Again, it's a key document. This document will have to be, of course, taking into account what NATO is doing with others, and I'm thinking about particularly the recently published EU strategic compass. Yeah. You know that 21 members of NATO are also EU members, so here we have an interesting synergies to develop.
Yeah. I think I'm also, because I think Christophe said it quite nicely, we're dealing with the balance between the current crisis and also how do we want to strategically maneuver as a NATO, but also as EU, because also the EU has this strategic compass, which is actually on the EU level sort of the same ingredients. How do you do that? Because I can imagine that right now in crisis, there's a lot possible, but at the same time, there are also things you can only in hindsight evaluate, while you're also trying to put an agenda forward. Is there a tension in that, and how should you address that?
Well, maybe we should start with the strategic compass, because that's a bit of a bad luck timing, because that's a
you talk about the EU strategic compass.
EU, yeah, because that's written for a different war, yeah, for a different conflict. I mean, it adds up to at most a force of 5,500 military, and it's people were thinking about evacuating people from Kabul. Maybe that will be a task that this new EU group could do. It will be impossible to deal with a Ukraine-type crisis. And it was just bad luck that this came out while we are looking at a much bigger thing. So it shows that you can do planning, whatever you want to do, but that when you represent a paper for one war and then all of a sudden on your doorstep, there's a next war.
But isn't that the idea of a strategic compass, that you sort of get resilient against things you don't expect?
Yes, of course. The good thing is that all of Europe starts thinking about investing in defense, realizing that defense is very important. Well, that's the thing that both papers have in common.
Yeah. Bob?
Well, the thing with the strategic compass, and also Kimberly and I had the pleasure of doing research into the European strategic autonomy question that preceded it, is that all the threats that were identified in a strategic compass, they haven't gone away. It's just another even bigger crisis sort of overtook everything, but still the threats that are identified in there are also all still on Europe's doorstep. So let's not forget them, and also let's think about how the current crisis, the Ukraine crisis, has all these knock-on effects on other things like food security in the Middle East and all the other problems that are still coming our way. So I agree very much with you, Michel, that it's a pity that the strategic compass now almost gets overlooked. And in Lithuania, people even said, why didn't we do NATO's strategic concept first and the strategic compass only afterwards? Because it's first and foremost about collective defense. And I think it would be a pity if we miss out on all the other dimensions that we need to address, including some where NATO might not be the best placed actor to address them. Many of them are of a hybrid nature. Yeah. Energy security, something Lithuania is also particularly concerned about, is not something that NATO can very easily address, but the EU has a much larger toolbox it can use.
Yeah, but at the same time, if we then look at the strategic concept by NATO, then it's also still a chance to put some things in there that might have been difficult right now at the EU level. So one of the things that keeps coming back is unity, and we've seen unity in the past few months with regard to the Ukraine crisis. But how can you, on a longer term, because then I can imagine if this crisis lasts longer, domestic problems or domestic politics also become more important again. People have to win elections, people have at home the polls, a refugee crisis in Europe. So is that also at NATO level, such a strategic concept, can that help to preserve unity in a longer term?
I think it can, because it's a moment when you all have to sit together and discuss, as was the strategic compass, actually the same thing, a joint threat analysis. What are actually the threats we're trying to defend ourselves against? And I think it will show not only where the differences of opinion exist, and I'm afraid, Ambassador, that you'll have many more discussions on China to come. Because more and more countries start to feel threatened by it in one way or another. But of course, the question if NATO is best positioned to counter these threats will then also come up immediately. But I think that process is essential. The only thing is that Michel is right. Once you're done with the document, the job hasn't been done. Yeah. And you actually need to update it all the time and make sure you're not just fighting the previous war.
And you have to always... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so what I would like to add to the discussion is, regardless of the strategic concept or the strategic compass or whatever document, and also regardless of what crisis we're in right now, when the hot phase is over, even in the war in Ukraine, it doesn't matter how long it lasts, hybrid will stay, right? And that's something we all know, which probably all European countries know, all NATO members know. So that is one of the topics we can, I think, unite around. And also, I think Marisa just said it, hybrid is not something that's bound within borders, right? So if you are asking us, isn't this something that we can strategically prepare for? Yes, we know that we will be dealing with hybrid threats on the longer term, and we can expect to also be affected by those threats back here. It's not just something that's happening over there in some far away country where more is going on. So if we want to think more strategically, that is something that we can prepare for right now.
But if you think about disinformation, for example, I can imagine that also within NATO countries there are quite some differences between narratives, as Marisa said, and at the same time you want to make a concept that puts that together. Yes. So I guess that's a difficulty we have to address, right?
Yes. It is a difficulty, but there are also many initiatives that are trying to work together to counter all these disinformation narratives. And I also feel that that is something that we can be much more proactive with. So, for example, think about what sort of narratives are adversarial countries putting out there. What does that mean? What is the effect of that narrative on certain populations? Because you're right, we have many populations within Europe, even within a country, even within subcultures, and so on and so on. And then consequently, what do we want to put against that, right? And research has shown that it's actually quite difficult to react to disinformation narratives, because the way our brain works is that if I tell you a story 100 times, so if you hear many, many times that Russia started a military operation in Ukraine, and then you get one message back, well, let me just say from our side, which is stating the objective facts that there's been invasion going on, the chances are very slim that you will believe that last message. So we need to be proactive and preemptive about that.
But then at the same time, I can imagine that if you look also from a sort of diplomatic level, you have, of course, the whole discussion or narratives, or I mean, it's not about the Eastern enlargement of NATO and the implicit goals that are supposed to be behind it, and which Russia uses to say, look, they are really threatening us. At the same time, when you're looking behind the concept at a more fundamental level, to what direction do we want NATO to progress, then I can imagine, do you need to take those narratives into account? Because at the one hand, you can say from a sort of technical perspective, well, for example, if Finland wants to join, then why shouldn't they? On the other hand, you can say we should think about how, for example, a country as Russia would interpret that, or what narratives we might strengthen with that.
Oh yes, but it has been thinking that all along. I mean, the relationship with Russia has been.
That's how we've been doing it.
How we've been doing it, and it hasn't worked. So there was one thing you said about this, one concept that's maybe important to pick up on. That's unity. That's the one big thing NATO has to sell. I mean, if it doesn't have any unity, then it has a major problem. So it has to do everything to preserve that unity. And at the same time have decent discussions going on to progress the organization. But you have to keep in mind there are 30 sovereign countries that have to work together every day there, and they have to see where they go in the future. And of course, if the immediate threat will go down a bit, you will see that everybody has his own interest, that there are difference of opinion, different threat analysis, different ideas within different groups in NATO. So it's always very important that they work on staying together, and that is in a peaceful time is much more difficult than now with an immediate threat.
Yeah, Bob?
Yeah, the question whether or not NATO is a threat to Russia. Now, let me give you just very briefly the Kremlin perspective on this to the extent that I can. Right? The one, of course, Russia from a military perspective does consider NATO as a threat if it builds up a large military close to Russia's borders. The whole idea of arms control was that we wouldn't do that, and that Russia also wouldn't do that. So you can manage that threat perception by actually discussing with Russia the way you deploy your forces. Now, that is not on the table at the moment. In fact, you'll see a reinforcement on both sides. So Russia will also deploy more and more to Belarus, because that has been more and more integrated in Russia's military space. But NATO is a threat to Russia in two other ways from the perspective of the Kremlin, because it defends values that actually threaten Kremlin core interests. The first one is the right of states to choose their own future. Ambassador, you mentioned it. That is a threat to a regime that regards the world through the lens of buffer states and spheres of influence. And by upholding that value and that open door policy that we have been very firm about, that actually threatens the Kremlin's worldview, and the democracy itself threatens it. Because a democratic and successful Ukraine would be a threat to Russia, or at least to the current government in Russia, because it would show an alternative of how Russia could also be governed. So in a way, the Kremlin does regard NATO as a threat on multiple levels.
Kimberly?
Yes, I agree with Bob, but it's all a matter of perspectives, right? For example, recently the EU, the West, has decided to ban certain Russian media channels. Let me say RT, Sputnik, and then you can wonder, to what extent does that actually serve our strategic goal, right? So yes, 2 media channels are being banned, which means that it's harder for certain populations to maybe reach the disinformation that they are portraying to the outside world. But you can wonder, might they be able to get that information elsewhere anyway? Second of all, how is that perceived by not only Putin, but also by the population that is living in Russia? Aren't we confirming anti-Western or anti-NATO beliefs that these people might be already having by basically handing the adversary tools to say, see, they aren't so democratic after all. They're also banning our media channels. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say, it is a matter of perspective. For us, it's a counter-reaction. We are protecting our population against disinformation. For them, maybe it feels like a threat.
Yeah. And the risk is, I fully agree with this one. We haven't discussed it enough yet. The resilience agenda was also one that said, don't be naive, because our values and our openness make us vulnerable to some of these hybrid threats. But in order to defend ourselves against it and to uphold these values, we have to compromise on some of them. One of them is the freedom of the media and freedom of expression, which you have to limit if you want to counter certain state-led narratives, but also economic security. The Dutch love open economies where everybody can invest in everything. Lithuania thinks completely differently and is protecting certain critical sectors and does FDI screening and things like that to counter the freedom of economic transactions. And the role of the intelligence services. I live in a country where there's strict limits on what the intelligence services can do, including when it comes to political actors, and I'm glad those limits are in place. But it limits their effectiveness in countering direct interference into domestic politics.
Maybe, Christophe, what we've been saying, or what also has been discussed here, is we don't want to be naive, and we have to accept that there is some sacrifice maybe in our values or the way we want things to be perfectly in order to really move forward with NATO and also things as a strategic concept. How do you listen to that?
Well, again, as the Dutch ambassador mentioned in her introductory statement, NATO is gathering of democracies, and from a democratic point of view, our values is something which is really the common interest, and I cannot see too much latitude from NATO and from the 13 democracies to sort of stay naive vis-à-vis what Russia did in Ukraine and did before, of course, as well in Crimea or in Georgia. So I think what will be very important in the future strategic concept and in our future discussions is to see how those democratic values will be implemented in the strategic concept, how we can sort of work with our partners as well and to share those values. I cannot see that really sort of we are going into a more divided world. And for sure, the discussion with Moscow and potentially Beijing in another dimension will be more and more difficult for the coming years and potentially decades.
Yeah. Maybe I want, before I open it to the audience, I have two more questions. One is maybe really small, but I was just wondering, should we also extend Article 5 to the digital sphere?
Is that a question
Yes.
in my direction? Well, I think that's a discussion that's been going on quite some time, but I think I would feel more comfortable redirecting it to someone else at the table.
Bob?
I think it already does.
Yeah?
NATO already agreed that a serious cyber attack that is equivalent in effects to an armed attack is covered by Article 5.
And what is an equivalent?
Well, that has to do with the amount of damage. So then we come to the debate on the threshold. I think
exactly.
Here we have to debate on how serious is it. I think we all agree. I mean, maybe a colleague from NATO can clarify that if it leads to a significant amount of civilian casualties, for example, taking out the energy grid of a country or a hospital or things like that, that would have that effect. Now, if it limits the ability of a state to function, that's also another question. So if you take out the entire telecommunications industry, but nobody dies, is it an armed attack? Now, here you have to actually debate with the lawyers, and there's quite different views within.
Yeah.
But it's Article 51.
So the structure is there, but how do you really fill it in, and what's the threshold? That's actually the debate, and there are some guidelines to it, but it's difficult to assess.
But it's the same with a conventional attack. So if a Russian missile by accident lands on Polish territory, do we immediately unleash a full-on conventional assault on the Russian Federation? There's also a threshold debate, right? So this threshold is not new. It's just that in the cyber domain, you have the additional problem of attribution. How do you really know it is a Russian attack? That's the difficulty, in addition to a regular conventional kinetic attack.
And maybe the last question before we open it up, I can imagine also that the question is actually how important are the coming few months, because we have established this sense of unity that's there right now. How important are what we're going to do with NATO and how we fill in this strategic concept, for example, in the future of NATO? How unique is then, it's a bit tragic considering the circumstances, but still how unique is the chance there is to really establish a new NATO that's up to date with the challenges we face maybe in 20 years?
Well, I'm not so excited about the whole concept, actually. I mean, it's quite simple. There's a list of threats that NATO has to tackle. Hybrid is big. We have to do something about China, and we have to rewrite the paragraphs on Russia. I think I'm much more excited about the coming weeks. How are we going to deal with the immense problem that we have on our hands? And that's a problem, basically, what NATO has been born for. I mean, its raison d'être, and it now has a chance for the first time to show how to deal with that. So I think all the questions that follow from the practical problem we have now from the war are more important or more interesting to me and more difficult, I think, to answer.
So actually, you're saying
the concept. The concept is fine, but if you look at the concept that's on the table now, it's a time document, and so you take the geopolitical position of that year, of that period, and you write it down. So in that sense, it's important, and it gives you some guidelines. But then,
so actually, the best safeguard for NATO in the future is to really do its work in this crisis and show in that sense.
Show that you do what you have to do in this crisis, and hopefully we find some way out of this crisis with NATO intact. That will be, I think, the better.
Yeah. You want something to add?
And maybe to add to that, I think it goes much further than just NATO, right? If you look at the challenges that we are facing right now and in the future, we need to build so-called democratic and societal resilience. And that means not only working together with other major institutions like the European Union, but also with local actors, universities, research institutions, etc. That's the only way we can really be prepared and also get stronger together.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any questions from the audience or insights maybe? Because I think we have room for two. Yes, because I've skipped your question the last time, so yeah.
Thank you all for this panel, and it just gave me more time to think, so that's not a problem. So I think a lot of people right now have said that this period is a turning point in history, or that we are entering a new era in international relations. And I think we can argue that there are three different stories that we can tell. And I think the first one is something we all agree on, which is the unimaginable harm that is being done in Ukraine by Russia. So I think that's one of the stories we can tell, and we should tell, because it's happening. And then two others are a narrative, a choice, I would argue. The first one is about regression and about war, competition. That we are entering an era that was something that we thought that was lost. And the second one is about cooperation. And it's about not threats, but about ways for progression. And I think that both those stories are, to a certain extent, not compatible. And when we're talking about NATO, a lot of times we're talking about threats and about competition and about ways to go forward without really going forward, in a sense, because it's not about solving solutions, whether it's security of food, whether it's climate change, because that requires cooperation and the knowledge that cooperation is possible. So I was just wondering whether or not you could elaborate on this thought and how we can go from the first stories about threat and competition to the second one, which is about cooperation, which is crucial. Thank you.
Michel, I saw you nodding.
Yes, of course. Well, climate change in China then obviously come to mind. I mean, it will be a disastrous outcome of this if we would lose the ability to deal and to talk to China and to cooperate with China on a few issues. And then climate change, of course, is being the big one. So if this was lead actually to a new Cold War, in a sense, with Russia and China and some other countries on one hand and the West on the other one, and there would be some kind of iron curtain in between again, and we wouldn't cooperate, that would be disastrous. That would be. I hope that will not be the outcome of this somehow. On the other hand, there are principles you can't compromise on. That's something we're learning now. I mean, the Ukrainians are fighting a war to have a choice, being like the West. That's basically what it comes down to. So you can't really compromise in your contacts with China all the time. But you can't burn the bridge either. So we'll see how that will work out. That's a good one.
Bob, the compatibility of those two narratives, actually?
No, of course. I mean, for diplomats, it's incredibly difficult to see the Bucha atrocities and then sit across the table from Russian diplomats and negotiate a treaty on the Arctic or on anything practical. But I still hope we can actually do that, because otherwise, if we don't, and I know there have to be diplomatic costs to Russia in addition to only economic costs. So there are also diplomatic sanctions. The problem is that if we continue down that path, and if China sides with Russia in many of these things, then all the institutions we have for global governance are falling apart. It's already happening, actually, at the UN level. level. And if you don't have the world's largest country in terms of territory and the most populous country in terms of population, how are you going to tackle a climate change challenge? And the pity of decoupling us from Russian energy imports is that we're now burning much more coal.
Yeah.
So in the short term, the climate is going to be the one suffering. Now, those are prices that we have to pay, I think. These are steps that we have to take. But I still hope that we continue to live in a world where some of the global challenges that are, by the way, very much in Russia's interest with its melting permafrost, can still be handled pragmatically.
Yeah.
But not right now.
Yeah. Maybe to conclude, Christophe, because I'm also curious how you would respond to this question.
Well, from my end, I think that, first of all, as you mentioned, it's very difficult for citizens living in democracies to compromise on all democratic core values. It's not possible, very, very clearly. And last week I was with Deputy Secretary General in Slovakia for a ministerial meeting, and a lot of allies mentioned that freedom is not for free, and it's something we have to keep in mind. It's not a given. And we are in the Western sort of world in a rather comfortable way of life, but these have to be really preserved. And sometimes it's costly, it's not easy, but we have to fight for that. And NATO is a tool, among others, but NATO is providing the security guarantee for all allied countries. Maybe it's a bit blunt, but I think we have to really be very firm on that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think we've elaborated on this question a bit longer. I think it was a really good question, so thank you for that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the break right now, and then we'll resume at 9:15, and then we'll dive a bit deeper into new ways of war and also hybrid threats. But for now, I'd like to give, and then we go to the break, a warm applause for my panel, Michel, Kimberly, Bob, and Christophe, and also Marisa again. So see you in 15.
Good evening, everyone. Is it? Good evening, everyone. Thank you for all being here. I think we will start again. We just had the break, and it's up to me to announce the winner of our essay competition. This year's essay competition provided an explicit opportunity for young thinkers, some of you are amongst us in the public, to share their perspectives on the challenges of that NATO has. We've received several submissions. Some were good, some were even better, and I'm very happy to announce the winner. We already announced a top 3, so we have Anders Lorentz, who is in the audience. He wrote a piece about the Arctic. Frank Stenks, he's also somewhere here. He wrote a piece about the energy politics. And we have Felix Swanty, and he wrote an essay on cyber warfare and how James Bond is still relevant. Well, that's the top 3. And the winner, that's well, yeah, they're all men. He's actually he's going to present his findings to you right after I announce who won. And well, some grumbling. The winner is Felix Swanty with his article on cyber warfare. Give him a big round of applause. Come on to the front, Felix. According to the jury, Felix did a great job in portraying the rise of the internet and how it did not only bring us wealth, but also created dependencies and vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah.
So we're very happy. We want to thank you, and well, I guess the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you. Yeah, all right. I'll just read it for you. It's called The Wild West of Today. Yeah, I'll start. In 1998, barely 24 years ago, Dutch cameraman and interviewer Frans Brommet headed out on the streets to ask people about a new thing that was starting to gain popularity, whether or not they owned a mobile phone. All answers came down to the same thing. No, I do not own a mobile phone and I'm not planning on using one in the future. Well, this, as most of us now know, hasn't aged well. Because the rise of the smartphone and with that the internet might have been the most important and influential development in the past 2 decades. Roughly 20 years after this interview in 1998, a few of the interviewees were tracked down. Each and every one of them now owned a smartphone, and most of them admitted they couldn't do without it anymore. In such a relatively short time, the internet and smartphones have become a part of us. No one, including governments and businesses, can go without it. And precisely this is what makes the internet a little unsettling. It was welcomed as something out of this world, which could help connect people from all over the world, which could make an economic boom happen. But the fact that politics, business and people have become so dependent on it makes the rise of the internet a lot less cheerful. Because where there's dependence, there's vulnerability, and where there's vulnerability, there's criminals. The criminals I'm talking about are hackers. With the rise of the internet came numerous new ways to make money, and hacking is one of those new ways. By sending malware, hackers can gain access to someone's most private information. Nothing is safe, from bank accounts to social media accounts. Hackers make good use of our dependence on and intertwinement with the internet. But as I said before, businesses and politics need the internet as well, not only people. And that makes them even more interesting targets for hackers. With this, a new species of hackers has emerged. Hackers who are being used by governments for political means. The modern spy. I think everyone here probably is familiar with James Bond. A handsome, charismatic Brit who woos everyone with his out-of-this-world fighting skills and his humor. This obviously somewhat romanticized image of spies is something we know all too well. But the days of weird gadgets and triple identities in casinos are long gone. Our days are the days of completely invisible hackers calling the shots in the world of espionage. Almost every intelligence agency on the planet has hackers working for them. Hackers who are continuously attacking unsuspecting companies, governments and people. Troll accounts are being created to spread fake news, company strategies and blueprints for complicated machines are being stolen, and elections are successfully being influenced. Just an example, estimations are that the Chinese government has 50,000 to 100,000 hackers at its disposal daily, who are paid to plan and execute digital attacks every day. The Russian government works with hackers collective Fancy Bear to attack mainly Ukraine and the US. The West participates in this as well, as we learned from Julian Assange's WikiLeaks. Hacking has become the single most important tool to collect intelligence and to cause chaos in other countries. And the number of digital attacks grows every day. The amount of digital attacks over the entire year 2014 was the same as the monthly amount in 2021, 8 years later. It's difficult to say how many of these attacks are linked to governments, and precisely that is a scary thing about this development. Hacking is way more anonymous than the spying James Bond does. Governments are able to erase every digital trace leading to them, making them able to deny any cooperation with hackers. To this day, the Russian president denies he had any involvement in a mingling in American elections in 2016. Right now in Ukraine, bombings and digital attacks are a daily fact of life. Again, Putin claims he has nothing to do with the digital attacks. The rise of daily cyber attacks and the growing censorship and number of framed or fake news reports caused the previously so gleefully welcomed openness of the internet to be doubted by more and more countries. Isn't it better to have your own internet, one you can shut off whenever you want, one which you can control and censor as you please without foreign hackers having access to it? A few countries already have this, like China, and Russia is experimenting with it as well. Slowly but steadily, the globalization process through the internet is beginning to stagnate. The global integration which the internet helped to speed up is coming to a halt, and with that the integration of realities and worldviews. The internet is, for the time being, something entirely new for mankind. It's the Wild West of the 21st century. We simply don't know really how to deal with it yet, but every day the internet strengthens its grip on us and we become more and more dependent on it. In 2030, the internet would be less lawless and more controlled. That could mean that we jump back to an era with different superpowers, each living in its own reality, back to the Cold War. If that happens, the world would be a little bit like James Bond's world again. That was it.
Thanks so much, Felix van Tee, for that column, and congratulations again on winning the column contest. Before we start with the next panel, we also have a short clip to introduce a little bit what we're going to talk about.
I think we're growing more aware as social media comes to play a bigger role within our daily lives. However, I think we tend to share things because it's so easy, and we should be more critical about what we're sharing online.
I think we're pretty aware, yet I'm not sure if people check every source as critical as they should.
I think, and I feel that our generation, and especially also the younger generation, they are much more aware of that everything they see online can be fake. That they grew up in this world. The Netherlands is a majorly networked country, very connected to the internet and very dependent also on communication systems. If there would be a cyber attack on our critical infrastructure, that could definitely cause problems.
I think we are aware that there is disinformation around. I think the main problem is how do we know what's real and what's not? And of course you try to verify your sources, but what that means essentially is that we look at credible sources, main newspapers, secure sources, verifiable sources, but it's not like everyone is doing their own fact-checking. So there's reason to be worried about that.
I think a cyber attack could affect my daily life, especially when those cyber attacks are aimed at critical infrastructures like banks or what we have seen with the NS in the Netherlands the past few months.
Yeah, so cyber is one of the new threats, and I think when looking at these hybrid threats, cyber can play an interesting role apart from conventional warfare and space domain. So cyber is another way of attacking or compose another threat. Therefore, it's important that we invest in it.
Yes. So, in the second panel, we're going to talk about hybrid warfare, cybersecurity, and we're going to do that with an amazing panel. Just as the last panel, actually, but again, an amazing panel. And just to introduce them to you, we're going to talk with Hester Somsen. She's the Deputy National Coordinator for Counterterrorism and Security, in Dutch the NCTV. We're going to talk with Kenneth Lassoen, Research Fellow at Klingendaal, specializing in security and intelligence. We're going to talk with Han Bouwmeester, Associate Professor Military Strategy and Land Warfare at the NLDA, also called the Nederlandse Defensie Academy. And we're going to talk with Julie Fisher, the US Special Envoy to Belarus. Warm welcome all. Just to start it off, I'd like to start with you, Julie Fisher. Thanks so much for being here. Just a short background. You are the first American ambassador in Belarus since 2008. And since 2021, you've become the US Special Envoy because you need to do your work from Lithuania because your visum got rejected. I was just, before we dive in the whole cyber threats and new ways of warfare, how has your past few weeks or months looked? Because I can imagine as a US Special Envoy to Belarus, this has been quite some weeks. So I'm just wondering, what are you doing on a daily basis right now as a Special Envoy?
Sure. Well, thanks. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Let me just start off by telling you, I think this is about the coolest NATO discussion I've ever taken part in. Wow. There's not... Don't tell the Atlantic Council back in Washington, but they're not serving enough alcohol, and
You know it's being live streamed, eh? They can listen to this. They're watching.
I do.
Yeah.
That is how decisions are made in Belgium.
So really, it really is a great pleasure for me to be here and to join this panel to consider these questions. I will tell you that, in fact, I was confirmed as the first U.S. ambassador to Belarus in 13 years, but I was never admitted. So reverted to becoming, or transitioned to become the U.S. Special Envoy for Belarus. And I think this is actually a question that fits pretty well into the context of this discussion, because for us, this was a question of not just looking at the problem set in Belarus and considering the repression, the violence that Lukashenko was bringing to his own citizens, the political prisoners that he was taking, the deteriorating situation inside Belarus. It was incredibly important for the United States to say, okay, he's not going to issue a visa. Well, we're not going to do perhaps we're not going to just fall back on diplomatic formalities and say, oh, well, okay, we'll just not have an ambassador. But what President Biden decided, what Secretary Blinken decided, was that we would advance U.S. interests with Belarus by coming closer to the problem set, if not on the ground in Minsk. And so I've been working in Vilnius since last fall, but spent a great deal of 2021 commuting between Washington, Vilnius, Warsaw, working with our Swedish partners in their capacity as chair of the OSCE last year. So, you know, part of thinking about the threats, the adversaries that we face these days is, I think, also taking a look, not just at those domains that we traditionally think of for NATO, right? Air, space, land, cyber, sea. I knew there's another one. I'm from a Navy family. But it is also thinking about how we adapt and how we adjust our diplomatic tools as well. And we do a lot of this. We do it by coordinating. It is those links that we build. For me, having served twice at NATO headquarters, once on the international staff and once within the U.S. delegation, to the U.S. mission to NATO, you know, it is those relationships that I have built with my Dutch counterparts, my Lithuanian counterpart, right? That these are the people that I work with again and again and again, and they show up in Washington, and they show up in Vilnius in new capacities, and it should not be underestimated. Just as training helps make sure that our forces are prepared to fight together, you know, what we do together and the relationships we build in Brussels are incredibly important.
Yeah. But then also it might be a bad comparison, but then you just correct me. Then you're also talking about narratives in that sense, that you've decided to say, okay, let's make it a special envoy. Let's not work under the radar and say we need to address the fact that we can't work there. That's also a way of trying to influence a narrative about how much you want to relate to a region and what's your stance in that, right? So that it's quite in the whole discussion we're having right now about information, disinformation, warfare that we're doing. And I'd also like to go to Hester Sampson. As the Deputy National Coordinator for Counterterrorism and Security, how much of your work or worries or is about new ways of threats, like cyber threats or hybrid warfare? How is that in your work right now?
I think quite a number, in the sense that before I worked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so then I was looking at what was happening in the outside world and then also talking to my colleagues at the NCTV, different ministries and others to indicate what kind of threats were upon them. And now actually I'm in a position to coordinate with different ministries to actually do something about it. Yeah. So it's the current threats that we have, and I think the essayist, sorry, I forgot your name, but really Felix perfectly outlined what the threats are in terms of cyber and also how quickly these are growing. And I think the connection between cyber criminals and state actors is something that we really have to worry about. There's a lot of money going on. There's competition between drugs criminals and cyber criminals as to who earns the most amount of money. Yeah. And they're smart investors, so they invest in new ways of operating. So the capacity of state actors and cyber criminal organizations is almost at the same. Some are at par. But then again, you ask for new threats, and of course there's different things coming upon us. Quantum computing is something I think we all worry about greatly. There's the competition with China about who is going to be the next leader of the technical revolution, and it's all these kind of things where we try to work together with institutions also, of course, and think tanks and universities to see what's coming at us and how should we prepare.
Yeah. Maybe Kenneth Lassoon, also to introduce you. You're specialized in security and intelligence. If you look at the threats we're facing, I always think like if we have, again, maybe it's a bad comparison, sorry for that. If you look at, for example, the drugs war that has been going on in the world, then, for example, if you look at government spendings, for example, you would say, okay, that's really great, but if you look at what one crime syndicate has in amounts of money, then, well, good luck with fighting that. If we look at cybersecurity and the threats we're facing, are we up for the challenge?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, no, there will be a lot more investment and a lot more work has to be done. The problem, of course, with this is that we see all the benefits of cybersecurity, and we just had it in the very nice video. How much we like our smartphones, how we have become, especially the younger one gets, the more addicted, or it actually becomes a literal physical extension of your hand or your thumb, which is normal because technological advances have so much potential. But unfortunately, we just only see the potential and we do not see the security risks. And it's counterintuitive for the private sector to want to achieve their economic mission and also have to think about the security implications, because that costs money and that impedes upon the economic mission. So there is a great deal to be done, and especially like, well, cyber is, with quantum computing, is a perfect example how speedily everything goes. Technology today is outdated tomorrow, and, well, governments are still reasoning in terms of the 19th century. So if we're going to be dependent upon them to react in a flexible manner to a cybersecurity, yeah, that's...
Yeah. Before we respond to that, I'd like to open the discussion also by inviting Han Bouwmeester, because I mean, we've been talking about the war in Ukraine, about the invasion and what's been going on. I hope I don't insult you, but you're very well informed in the conventional warfare, the way we know it, and at the same time we see also in Ukraine, I think, the new threats playing out and what's been going on. How do you see those? The old ways we maybe know and the new ways intertwine with each other?
Well, what is old and what is new? New is fighting with tanks. That is warfare 2022. So why should we call it old? It's a way of fighting. Well, let's bring it back. If we're talking about the conventional component, we're talking about fighting with armed forces. If you look at NATO, if we're talking about hybrid warfare, or the NCTV likes to use the word hybrid conflict much more, which I prefer as well. But they use...
We'll come back to that debate.
Yeah.
Okay, but I've been writing down some things already. Yeah.
But they're using how to prevent yourself from it. They're using the acronym DIMEFIL, which stands for the diplomacy and politics, information, military, economics, financial flows, how the rebellions are financed and what you can do about it. It's about the intelligence and the gray zone they operate in, and the way private military companies and civilians who are organized and trained by intelligence services. And the last letter is the L. It was law enforcement, but where the police and the armed forces meet together, it's also about legal implications, and it's about lawfare. Yeah. It's how to fight with rules and regulations internationally in your own purpose.
Yeah. Maybe because you wanted to pitch in on the hybrid warfare versus hybrid conflict. Why is that an important distinction to make?
Well, first and foremost, I think there's actually just when it comes to fighting wars versus engaging in conflicts, I think this is just a bit of a nerve in NATO in general, right? Are we preparing to fight wars, or are we preparing to manage conflict, right? And it is worth recognizing. It is worth recognizing that if we want to prevent conflict, I think we must be prepared to fight wars. And so, this is a moment, right, that is reminding us. And look, NATO goes through cycles of, support and waning support and growing support, just like any institution. I think this is all very normal. But I've taken part in discussions at headquarters where, people, 10 years ago, really questioned whether anybody would ever buy a tank again. And, here we are, 2022. And in fact, right, how fast can tanks be made today is an important question. And so when it comes to thinking about hybrid, if we are talking, there is hybrid in the context of war, and it is, right, and we need to recognize it for what it is.
We shouldn't be smoothing it just for the sake of
We absolutely should not, because it can be as destructive to our societies as combat and, hot fighting.
Yeah. Hester, how do you listen to this?
Well, I totally agree, but I think the reason why we use hybrid conflict, because it might not lead up to the threshold that also Bob Dane spoke about earlier on. And it still can affect your interest, and you still want to do something about it. So I totally agree that you should always be prepared, and I think that's the whole idea about NATO, to be an organization that in its core has the idea to defend all its members and all its allies, and hence that means that you should also be prepared for warfare. Yeah. But on the other hand, I think what we saw in the last decade or so, and maybe even a bit more, is that this hybrid conflict is a constant. So it's ongoing in all different kind of arenas, and we should be aware of it, and we should try and make sure that we are as resilient as possible to that in all sorts of ways.
And what is the role of NATO in that? I mean, there are many actors that can help in this, in that sense. At the same time, we see that with regard to, for example, disinformation, that we've been, and also with cybersecurity, Kenneth's answer was no, quite bluntly, on the question, are we prepared for that? Yes, so maybe you can respond to that, because well, first your response, and also what's the role of NATO in that regard?
Yes, well, I think Kenneth has a perfect point into the business model of cybersecurity, because for now we don't have the obligation for companies to be cyber secure as we have, for instance, for a water company to supply healthy water, or for the automobile industry to make sure that the cars are safe, or these kind of things. So there's a set of norms and regulations that might be lacking at the moment, and that we're working on also when it comes to vital infrastructure and so on. So I think that's one point, that you really have to make sure that businesses nowadays also grasp the need for cybersecurity for themselves. Yeah. In cyber, you don't have to be the target to become the victim. I think that's very clear. So you have to be prepared. You have to do certain basic hygiene measures, as they are called, and it's not that complicated. And the good thing is that it works for everybody. If it's a state actor, or it's a cyber criminal, or it's a cyber junkie, so a young kid on his attic, it works for everything. So it means segmentation and two-factor authentication, all these kind of measures that you can use. So listen to your CISO, I would say, to all the companies in the Netherlands. And we try to now also, with the war in Ukraine, indicate that this is really at our doorstep. So really step up to the plate and make sure that you increase your cyber defense.
Yep. And if
in
we look
your
at the
living room, I'm sorry, they're not on your doorstep, they're in the living room.
Yeah, might be even. And of course, there's measures taken, like for instance now with a directive in the European Union for the Internet of Things, so things that are connected to the Internet, that we set rules and regulations. But the machinery, the legislative machinery, of course, is slow.
Yeah.
So that might be a problem, but it also is about the awareness of people. It's cheaper to buy it from China, but you don't have the safest stuff.
But then maybe Kenneth also, because if you look at the war in Ukraine, is the cyber warfare component, is it enough out there what has been going on? Because we're seeing the tanks, we're seeing the horrific images, but the cyber warfare component, should we give that more weight also in our analysis?
I would say yes, because the problem is that it's not that visible, indeed. That doesn't mean it's not happening. Perhaps I would grant you that it is not happening in the way that we expected it to. But there again, there were two schools of thought. One would be that we would have Hollywood disastrous scenarios of everything blowing up because of a cyber attack. And what we see now is just simply a massive occurrence of the classical vandalism that has always happened in cyberspace. Big DDoS attacks, phishing attacks. But a little bit more advanced is perhaps the story that came out 2 days ago about how Viasat satellites have been hacked, and not just because they mainly work for the Ukrainian government, but also because Viasat is a US defense contractor. So it's a way of signaling. But yeah, I agree that it hasn't been given a lot of attention, but there is a broad range of threat actors which are very active right now and have been for the past 6 months, preparing the field, the cyber domain, for the war in Ukraine, with advanced persistent threats groups, as they are called, who are really doing massive attacks, and they're very sustained. They take hours on end, and their amplification ratio has been record-breaking. We're talking about millions per hour or whatever in terms of the botnets that they are using. So it is happening. It is happening very much, but it's just not as destructive as we were expecting the next cyber war to be.
Yeah. So, But do you think that this is really a case, though, that there's a fog of war around this cyber as well, and so truly understanding the nature of who's being attacked, where the attacks are coming from, right? I think that is a particularly important question, particularly in the moment, right? There's a lot of people making claims. There's a lot of people putting themselves forward. There's a lot of actors who aren't so obvious, who are engaging. And I have this feeling that the more we will learn in every respect about what is happening inside Ukraine, whether it is what's happening between combat forces or in the cyber domain, I think there's going to be a tremendous amount. And this kind of speaks to your question about where is NATO's role? And a big role for NATO is that when there is, in this conflict, as we watch, and I'm sure you all have spent time talking about the human suffering that is unfolding in front of our eyes, and I want to acknowledge that in every possible way. But as we do that, and as we look to strengthen the Ukrainians' abilities to fight and to support Ukraine so that they can prevail, there is also something very important for our alliance in terms of learning from this conflict and the lessons we will derive from it in every one of these domains. And NATO is particularly well positioned to provide that information across the alliance, right? Because we will all take something different from it, and it is when we share that information that it becomes useful for our defense, and that is incredibly important.
But then maybe, Han, because one keyword in our first panel was unity, and I can imagine, especially if we talk about, for example, disinformation, if we talk about the amount of influence also the private sector has on our digital sphere, I can imagine that achieving unity, we've been talking about the NATO strategic concept, the EU strategic concept, and we have regulations coming from different places. We have the server stands there, and it's being used in how. Well, the question is actually, do you see unity happening if we talk about these kind of cyber threats, but also disinformation which is going on? Because there are different narratives, different interests.
On the international front, yes, absolutely, but it is forced unity. It's created now for a couple of weeks by Russia. This was exactly the incentives we needed to have more unity. And well, back to your earlier question, what is the role then of NATO in hybrid conflict or hybrid warfare? I think it's a very important role, but they cannot cover all the elements. NATO in itself, it's a political and military alliance. And it's not an economic alliance or doing something about disinformation. They always think that it's a military thing to debunk disinformation, but it's not. So, yes, and what we see is that we need to work together NATO together with the United States, with Canada, with the EU. And this is what I called forced unity, where you see that I think that the strategic compass of the EU was already published, and now they're working on the strategic concept of the NATO. And now it's the big question, is it in line with each other?
You don't agree? You say it's a military task to debunk disinformation?
Absolutely.
How would that work?
You are experts in information operations. It is an essential military task. And you have very good manuals on how to do information operations. It's an important part of counterintelligence and counterdeception is to indeed garner the truth or defend the truth.
I absolutely agree with you. We do have the knowledge. We do have the capacity to do this. But it's also about the things we agree on within the government. We have, for instance, the NCTV, who also plays a role in this. We have the intelligence services, and we have the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which have a distinguished section which is called disinformation and working on it. So we can play a part in it, but we're not in the lead.
But then maybe also, Julia, I can...
You should be.
You should be, you say. And then maybe also, Julia, I can imagine in your work, I can imagine there's a lot right now on everyone's plate. At the same time, you want to sort of make sure that not everyone is kicking the ball to each other, saying, I mean, we see the threats, but this is really something that this party should be dealing with. Or if we talk about disinformation, that's something that's up to the country and its media, or we should look at the European Union, or we should look there. So how can you make sure that, well, the sort of tendency is towards how can I pick up the ball instead of where can I kick it to?
Yes, yes. You know, I think this is such an important question, and it applies in this case related to this set of issues, but it's so, I mean, it's a constant challenge. I think as we work together inside the alliance, as I work inside my own government, right, the who does it belong to question is always important. And I will say this, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. It is not reasonable to look at the military and say, this is your job. It is not, they have a role to play. They have an incredibly important role to play. But there are so many actors who must play a role. I'll talk about my own country where cybersecurity, right, you know, is such a devolved concept inside the United States, right? That how we regulate infrastructure, how we regulate the governance of utilities, right? State by state by state by state. And you know, the question of the role of local governments, of corporations, right? You think about the important role that they play, first and foremost, frankly, in advancing much of our cybersecurity capabilities, right? And how do we keep them focused on producing it for those purposes that are useful for our societies, and then keeping it out of the hands and keeping those technology focused on what serves us and not what works against us? I think these are really key questions.
Yeah. Kenneth?
Well, to begin with, it's funny you should say that, because on my desk at the Klingendaalhuis, I have a 500-page manual by the US Army on information operations, which is quite excellent, actually. And it proves my point that in terms of execution, the Army is very well placed, and they have the expertise, because then you sideline the argument on cybersecurity, and we have to separate these two things. Information operations is something that we have been doing for thousands of years. There is nothing new, as you said, Han. Absolutely nothing new about hybrid threats. This is just part of the toolbox of international politics. And the fact is that it's simply what has changed the dynamic is indeed the introduction of cyber, and the fact that it has become so easy and so quickly to disseminate false information and just send it around the world in a matter of, well, just a fraction of a second. That's the cybersecurity part of it. But we have to separate the technical side of hybrid threats from the ancient traditional side of hybrid threats, And that's where the army comes in, because they have the expertise and they've been doing this for thousands of years, along with the intelligence services.
Yeah. Hester, maybe also?
Well, maybe the whole debate about disinformation also relates to the resilience of your own society. Yeah. Are they capable? And I think we had the same discussion with Bob and Kimberly just now about what kind of democratic values do you share, and how do you want to prepare your, and it was in the movie as well, your population, that things that they might read might not be true. And I think that's easier to say when you live in the Netherlands, where the proportion of disinformation is maybe still to an extent acceptable, and still many of the youngsters, when they wake up, first thing they check is our NOS app, so that's broadcasting, so that's generic and genuine information. So that makes it more easy. We had the discussion about Sputnik and RT, like is that a good idea or not? If you have a Russian-speaking population in your country of over 30% in one of the neighboring countries where Julie is living, then that might be a good idea, because it's so much information that you can hardly expect from those people to actually disseminate like what's true, what's not true. So, and that's a very difficult and painful debate. And I think if we inject the military as the ones who are the experts in the Netherlands, I'm sure that everybody would get goosebumps and think, well, but that's not how we want to do it in our democratic society. So it's also how, and of course we use each other's expertise, but I think also about what role of NATO is, that's not to counter or debunk the disinformation, but to help in creating the awareness. And the role of NATO, what I really like that was decided last year also during the summit, is to focus more also on resilience within the countries of the alliance. Because that's extremely important. Are we resilient enough? How long can we stand a certain pressure on our societies? And that goes that we have this political table, all the members, all the alliances, countries around the table, and discuss things like cyber and disinfo and climate change and all these kind of things that will inflict our own societies.
But then maybe because, and I'm sure that's also what the conversation should be about, but then how do you, maybe to conclude, if we want that, how do you measure resilience? What are the things that constitute to being resilient? Because at the same time, you could say, for example, if we talk about the association treaty in the Netherlands and the disinformation that has also been injected into the Netherlands, then would we say that we were resilient or were we not? So then again, I mean, that may be the word of the night, but then what's the threshold until when you are resilient and when you're not? How do you define that?
That's $100 question, I think, really. But I think the fact that we haven't lived through dire times for a long time also makes us less resilient. And the fact that our companies do not see the threat that's coming at them, also from state actors, also proves to the fact that we're not that a resilient society, that we're not prepared for that. So there's all sorts of signals within our society that we should do more.
Yeah, and we should listen to that. Signals, maybe. So I'd like to open up also for a few questions maybe at the end of the night. Are there people who can't sleep if they haven't asked that question or made that comment maybe? Yes, there is a question on the...
That's a high threshold.
Yeah.
Thanks. My question relates to the private sector, which you mentioned just now. And is it true that there is a hesitance from the private sector to collaborate on sharing information which might be sensitive for these companies? And how do you engage them in the process against disinformation and against cyber attacks?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And of course, there are reasons for companies to be reluctant. Because, for instance, if your investors might be also scared by the fact that you've been hacked and you have had a huge attack on you. So the question is, how can you share this kind of information in a confidential space that others can also learn from it and also prepare themselves for that? And we try to do that. We do that to a certain extent, but we also need other legal bases for that and other systems. So actually that we're in the midst of the process of talking to all different kind of private sector, but also different governmental sectors, also to improve that information exchange. And that goes that's very positive. I think everybody's welcoming that. So there's the appetite for the sharing, but now of course we have to regulate it, make sure we have the proper legal basis for that. But I'm very positive that we can do that in a couple of, well, at least present with the outcome of the research that we're doing at the moment.
Do you also share with other countries?
We do. Within the EU, of course, we have the cooperation between the different CERT, so the different cyber community, like the National Cybersecurity Center in the Netherlands, with all their counterparts. There's international cooperation also. There's a trusted smaller group with whom you can share everything, and others you just cannot based on regulations or based on trust.
Any other questions? Yes, there's one row in front.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of analysis in the media and in the public space before Russian forces crossed the border into Ukraine was the scenario of Russia completely dominating the Ukraine with conventional forces, but also using cyber attacks, taking out their critical infrastructure. But what we see right now is that not only are their conventional forces unable to really reach a lot of their objectives, but we also see that the light is on in Ukraine, telecommunications are still working. So my question is, have we really fundamentally misjudged and overestimated Russian capabilities, both conventional but also hybrid?
Han, maybe.
No, I don't think so. Yesterday I read an article written by one of the assistant generals, secretary generals of NATO. It was published in Foreign Affairs. And he was talking about the cyber war now, which is at the moment conducted by Russia. And he thinks it's very effective. Although we expected maybe something else. But what is happening is that they made a link between, and this is what you do in a hybrid model, is where you link certain lines together, the conventional line and the cyber line together to get a very good effect out of it, which they did. And they expected for the conventional operations that they were already in Kiev within a couple of days. So what they didn't do, and this was explained in this article, is that they didn't take out electrical grids or other very vulnerable infrastructure because they thought they would use it for themselves as soon as they were in Ukraine then. So no, I think they're still very effective, and they're still very effective to do so. On the other hand, what we see in the days and months prior to the invasion is that they were helped by Western countries in order to reinforce their strength and how to defend themselves against these kind of attacks. And they were very effective as well. The Ukrainians are very effective in stopping the attacks.
Yeah, maybe just a short follow-up on this question, because also, I mean, NATO has said we're in for the long run. I mean, the war is not gonna end soon. At the same time, there's also, if we talk about narratives, and it maybe links a bit to this question, like, did we, in the sense that if Russia doesn't succeed, overestimate their strength, and in that sense maybe also made choices that put us on a path? How do you also think about controlling the narrative afterwards? Because I mean, that's also a thing. How do we evaluate what has been happening? Some people will say, well, maybe they didn't have such a modern army as was in the reports for all these years, and the modernizations didn't work.
Right, right. Well, I mean, I think it's possible to look at some of the messaging out of the Kremlin over recent years about the superiority of some new weapon systems and things like this, and read into that the way any government talks about new procurements and investments, right?
It's always
right?
good,
like,
and it works.
It's always the best, and it's better than the other guys, right? So, look, the question of whether we have thus far, as we look at this conflict, I think the question is, have we overestimated Russia's capabilities and underestimated Ukraine's to this point? We're at such an early stage. I just believe it's too early to draw these conclusions. And, you know, the fact remains, I mean, the Ukrainians, it's not just resilience, their will to fight. to defend their homeland. It is theirs, their right to exist. That is what is driving them in this fight. And I don't think that's something that you can fully account for in all of the charts of, that account for equipment and, rounds of ammunition and things like this.
And let's not forget all the atrocities that have been going.
That are absolutely. But I also think when it comes to the Russians, right, what motivates them or what doesn't motivate them in this fight is an absolutely essential part, again, of understanding where they are. Are they going to turn to different weapons? Right. Again, it's so early, and we know certainly that Russia has capabilities it has not put to work. And so, again, there is absolutely no way to answer that question at this point.
Yeah. Maybe one last question before we close off. Is there someone? There are two questions. I see Niels walking already, so I think a choice has been made.
I hope it's about that.
Thanks for that, Niels. That helped me a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry for taking the last question.
No.
So one of the great successes of the pre-war period was U.S. intelligence getting knowledge about the Russian invasion early, but it was harder to get the Ukrainians to act on that knowledge. So my question was, how does NATO get countries which are still on the fence with a foot on both sides of the pond to act on intelligence NATO has on imminent threats which they are facing, especially considering Taiwan, for example? Thank you.
That's a good and big question to end on, I would say. Who would like to take up the ball first?
Yeah, I'm Belgian. I live in Brussels. I have the benefit of having, because of that, quite some access to every sucker that has had the honor of serving as Supreme Commander of NATO. And whenever I ask a question like that, we need some Belgian beer to continue the discussion, because all any sucker ever does is complain about the intelligence arrangements in NATO. And especially getting from a decent intelligence picture, the situational awareness, to actually getting some people to act. That kind of sums up the whole issue here. It's so difficult for an intelligence service on a sovereign national level to get their politicians to do something about the reports that they produce, let alone that NATO can actually play a role in this. Unfortunately, this is kind of where the news is rather bad. So it's not a good last question. Yeah.
but maybe there's a different answer also. I don't know. How would you?
Well, let me say this in terms of how NATO consumes intelligence. I think the new division that stood up, I believe in 2017 is when we stood up the new intelligence and security division. That what it gave to NATO is actually something really important, because in my experience, intelligence is most useful to people who are regularly engaging in the product and regularly reading, regularly engaging with the people who produce it. That is what is useful. There is rarely one report that will come out that is, white hot, that changes your thinking about everything. It is about a commitment to sustained attention, which is hard when the world is busy. And what this new division gives us at NATO is the ability to have that sustained conversation about a range of topics that we have to have as an alliance, right? We don't have the luxury of focusing only on this war at this point. NATO has to continue its ability to defend the alliance and all 30 allies in all domains.
All right. I think we're going to close it there for now. I think we discussed a lot. Also, maybe to contribute to that question, we again come also back to the NATO strategic concept and the way that's going to work out maybe. So it's going to be exciting months. At the same time, I think we discussed quite a lot today. Unity was one of the keywords. We're going to close it off, and I would just like to say to you that, well, again, first of all, there are drinks upstairs, but for the people at home, you can get a drink in your fridge, of course. But I would like to remind you, because I forgot it in the break, that there's also an information market in the hall next door. So you can go there immediately. You can also choose your beer first and then walk back. I mean, but make sure you visit there, because there are some organizations like Young Defense, Atlantic Commission, TNO, and some more who can give you some information, and you can ask your questions there. But for now, I'd like to close. But foremost and lastly also, I'd like to do that by thanking our panel and give them a very warm hand. Hester, Kenneth, Julie, and Han. And thanks for watching.